Welcome to the SCI Forum podcast. This podcast was produced by the Northwest Regional Spinal Cord Injury System in the University of Washington Department of Rehabilitation Medicine. The Northwest Regional SCI system is dedicated to improving the lives of people with SCI through excellent patient care, research, and education. To learn more about our podcasts and videos or to make a donation, go to sci.washington.edu.
Hello and welcome to the Spinal Cord Injury Forum podcast. My name is Jeannie Hoffman and I'm the director of the Northwest Regional Spinal Cord Injury System and a clinical psychologist and professor at the University of Washington Department of Rehabilitation Medicine. Today, I'm talking with Chet Moritz about his current spinal cord injury research here at the UW. Dr. Moritz is an associate professor in the departments of electrical and computer engineering, rehabilitation medicine, and physiology and biophysics, if that isn't enough, right? He is also the co-director for the Center for Neurotechnology. That's a lot of jobs.
It is a lot of jobs. Yeah, maybe it is enough.
Absolutely. So thank you, Chet, for spending time with me today. It's nice to have you here. And can we just start by kind of, tell me a little bit about your background and, what brought you to the UW, what brought you to your research?
Sure. Thanks. It's great to be here, Jeannie. Thanks for having me. So our research focuses on restoring hand and arm function for people who've had a spinal cord injury. And we really came to that over the last 20 years, starting by studying how people move their hands without a spinal cord injury. I did that at the University of Colorado as a postdoc. And then became interested as a second postdoc here at the University of Washington in how we could use technology or neural devices to try to enhance recovery after injury, spinal cord injury or stroke at the time.
So what's the three departments about? How does that all play into your current research?
Yeah, so we have on this campus a really nice collaboration between the College of Engineering, where I'm in the new Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering, recently renamed, and Rehabilitation Medicine, which is in the School of Medicine. And what we're trying to do with these collaborations is really bring technology developed by our engineers and our computational neuroscientists across the street to translate it into clinical practice as quickly as possible. So we have a shared lab space, the Amplifying Movement and Performance Lab, that we're really excited about. And we now have some joint faculty appointments across these departments, which really helps to create the critical collaborations to translate technology into healthcare.
Where did spinal cord injury come into your research training and research interest?
Yeah, it started near the end of my second postdoctoral fellowship, and there we were using a brain-computer interface to directly stimulate muscles with the idea that we might be able to help someone who had a paralyzed hand due to stroke or due to spinal cord injury. And it was through that research that we realized that the ideal application of this type of technology was really to people who have cervical-level spinal cord injuries. And so that began our interest in studying spinal cord injury, both in animal models and now in human subjects, to try to see how we could make best use of that technology to really help people improve their quality of life.
So animal models, what kind of animals have you started by studying?
Yeah, we've studied both rodents, rats in our case, a little bit of mice studies, but we've also studied non-human primates. Now in the non-human primates, or the monkeys, we don't actually perform a spinal cord injury. In this case, we use reversible types of paralysis. So we might inject an anesthetic into their nerves. So for several hours, they would have trouble moving their hands and arms, but then they would recover afterwards.
Mm-hmm. So being very cautious about your use of animals, which is very cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
So tell me a little bit about, really, I think what people are very excited about and really interested in is the work that you're doing with humans at this point. And so kind of tell me about the current studies and what kind of you're working on right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are stimulating the spinal cord non-invasively, so on the surface of the skin, and we call that transcutaneous or through the skin electrical spinal stimulation. And in order to pass enough energy through the skin to activate the spinal cord, we use a very high frequency waveform, so 10 kilohertz waveform. And what that effectively does is anesthetize or numb the skin so that energy can pass through and then activate the spinal cord down below the skin and below the layers of muscle.
Have you let them put this on you?
I have tried it on my arm. I haven't tried it on my spinal cord yet, but it's actually a very interesting demonstration. So you can put these electrodes on the back of your arm, for example, and if you turn on a normal type of waveform, you'll start to feel the pins and needles, sort of the prickling sensation that you might get if you were using a TENS unit or other types of just very mild electrical stimulation. And you can go up to a certain level, let's say 5 milliamps of current, and then it becomes, tolerable, but maybe a bit uncomfortable. If you turn on then this high carrier frequency, the sensation completely goes away at that same stimulus level. And then you can go about 5 times higher in the current before you get back to that same level of sensation.
How did y'all figure that out?
Yeah, I wish we had figured it out. We actually have brilliant collaborators at UCLA and some collaborators in Russia who actually figured this out decades ago when they were trying to stimulate the muscles of Olympic athletes. And so they found that they could activate the muscles of these athletes at much higher currents if they used this high frequency. So it actually became known as the Russian method of FES. And there are actually clinical stimulators that have a little knob that says Russian method. Now, the ones in the States use a slightly lower frequency, so it's not quite as effective for numbing the skin. But the group that we've been working with at UCLA has adapted it to stimulate the spinal cord and really picked a better frequency, I think, to pass this current into the spinal cord.
That sounds really cool. So where are you guys at in terms of, so you put this on people's spinal cords, on their neck, right? And you get this current to go through. What kind of impacts are you seeing so far? What are you looking for?
Yeah, so we have 2 studies. One we stimulate the neck region, and the other we actually stimulate in the lumbosacral region for walking. But we'll talk about the neck study first because we have more results from that. What we're seeing are very exciting things. So we're seeing when the stimulator is first turned on, people with incomplete spinal cord injuries become stronger. They're able to move their hands and arms better, produce greater forces. And that benefit gradually accumulates over time, over the course of a month or 2, when the stimulation is combined with intensive physical and occupational therapy. The stimulation alone doesn't seem to be enough to cause a change, but the stimulation enables people to participate in the therapy at a much higher level of movement and a higher level of force. It's as if we've turned up the gain or turned up the volume in the spinal cord so that it can hear those signals coming from the brain, and those signals coming from the brain then have a bigger effect on the movement of the hands and arms. And the most exciting part for us is that after several months of stimulation combined with therapy, we can turn the stimulator off, and all of the benefits that have accumulated over those months persist for several months longer, even with no further stimulation. So using the stimulator is an aid to get you there with the rehab, but once you're there, the stimulation is no longer required.
Well, that's amazing.
It is very exciting. We've even seen people who are completely paralyzed, an Asia B individual we worked with recently. And it took a month or so of stimulation for him to regain movement of his hands, but he did eventually regain the ability to move his fingers and thumb and produce measurable forces when he pinched his fingers and thumbs together. And that also persisted for several months after the stimulation.
Right. So when you say a combination of stimulation and PT, are we talking about like hours of stimulation and PT every single day? Are we talking about like a usual PT session that's an hour long and the stimulation happen? Is that like 3 days a week? Or kind of tell me a little bit more about the amounts of time that people are spending.
Yeah, absolutely. The current study design is 1 hour per day, 3 days a week. And the stimulation is running that entire time if they're in the phase of the study where we're stimulating. We do that for 4 weeks, so that's 12 sessions, and then we repeat that for another 4 weeks. And we'll sometimes randomize the order. Sometimes there'll be physical therapy alone for 4 weeks, and then physical therapy plus stimulation, and then we might cross over and repeat that sequence. And so over the course of 24 sessions of physical therapy with stimulation is where we're seeing these benefits. So it's a fairly standard physical therapy paradigm. We think the more you do it, probably the better that you will get. Our first participant came in 4 to 5 days a week, but only for a month. So same total dose, about 20 to 24 sessions, but compressed in a month. We're stretching it out now because we think people do better with more space between the exercise routines. Certainly they develop less kind of muscular soreness soreness and things. Our first participant, just like you would get if you started going to the gym after many years of not exercising, just developed some very low-grade soreness that would resolve over the weekend, but would accumulate throughout the week of intensive training with the stimulator.
And it sounds like that actually matches more of a kind of normal schedule, normal PT schedule. Now, people have to be incomplete, so Asia B or
B, C, or D
Okay.
are the groups we're working with now. We're excited to try it eventually in people who are Asia A. And if we have time, I'll talk about some of the other studies coming out of other labs that are seeing good success in people who are Asia A. But we, at the moment, have limited to at least sensory incomplete.
Right.
Because we want to know that there's some potential for signals from the brain to make it to the spinal cord. I think that may be important, although, to be honest, we haven't tested it in people who are Asia A, so we don't know.
Don't know yet. And then how long post-injury? I mean, are you trying to get people early after injury, or is this something that people who are 5 or 10 years out could even benefit from?
Yeah, we wait at least a year after injury, and the reason for that is just scientific. We want to make sure that the fastest spontaneous recovery, which might happen in that first 6 months or a year, has already occurred, and that's just so that we can control for the additional benefits of stimulation. Then we've worked with people anywhere from 1 or 2 years after injury out to about 7 years, I think is our longest current participant. Our collaborators at UCLA, I believe, have worked with someone who's 20 years post-injury and seen benefits. So we don't, at the moment, think that there's a limit, and we actually think potentially earlier could be better, but just for scientific reasons, we're waiting at least a year to begin the studies.
So at this point, it sounds like everybody's getting some benefits. You're seeing benefits pretty much across all participants. How quickly do you get it into clinical practice?
Hopefully very soon. So the company we're working with, which is a startup company out of UCLA, has just set up a 5-site clinical trial. So we were the first site outside of UCLA. We've been collaborating with them for several years now, but they've just set up 5 sites total, so 4 additional sites. And the hope is over the next year or two to do the randomized study at these 5 sites and demonstrate both safety and efficacy so that the device could be sold at least to physical therapists initially and eventually perhaps directly to individuals for home use.
Very exciting stuff. Is it a placebo control randomized trial? So are people getting all of the initial numbing of the thing, but just not the stimulation? Is that going to be how you're going to do this?
That's what we're working on right now, and it's a very tricky thing to control for. There's obviously could be a placebo effect. That's certainly important to control for. There also may be benefits to electrically just stimulating the skin. So there's several studies out there. Adele Field-Foote has some studies showing that electrical stimulation, typically applied to the arm, as in tactile cueing and other things, can actually increase recovery quite a bit. So we're trying to figure out how to design the randomized, ideally triple-blinded study that will not have a functional benefit. Because otherwise we'll need three arms, right? We'll need no stimulation, placebo stimulation, which could have these tactile benefits. There are actually some old studies in the cat showing that if you stimulated the skin over the back, you could induce walking and things like that. So there's a confound to the placebo that we're trying to sort out.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting, but really fun.
Exactly.
So you're also saying that you're also looking at walking. So that's a huge thing as well. And we know that there's a lot of research out there about implanted stimulators, but there seems to be a lot of problems with implanted stimulators of people rejecting or getting clogged up with being in the body, I guess.
Sure.
So tell me about the ones you guys are doing. What's the work you're doing?
Yeah, so it's an interesting story because our first participant, his name is Joe Beatty. He's okay if we share that. While we were stimulating his neck, he has an incomplete C3 central cord injury. So he's Asia D. Was C3. Interesting, he converted to a C4 after he was in our study for hand function. But he noticed while we were stimulating his neck that his legs were getting better. So he could stand before he joined our study, but he needed a lot of help balancing and in taking steps. And what he told us was that when we first turned the stimulator on, again, only focused on his neck, that he could feel where his leg was under the table. So this sense of proprioception, or where your limbs are in space, came back almost immediately. He also told us that he could move his leg when he couldn't otherwise bring his leg from the outside towards the center, or what we call adducting. So that happened during the hand study. And so Joe was actually the advocate that pushed us to design a study for walking using the same stimulator. And so what we did in Joe's case, it took us about a year to get the IRB in place and to get the body weight supported treadmill and things ready for him. We continued to stimulate around his injury in the neck, but we added electrodes to the lumbar and sacral enlargements of the spinal cord, which we know are involved in standing and walking. And then we started by training Joe to stand and balance with the stimulator running, then eventually walking on the treadmill with body weight support, and then walking over ground. And he actually made tremendous progress, again, over this about 4-month period where there was physical therapy alone, then physical therapy with stimulation, and then we repeated that sequence. And he went from requiring either body weight support or full contact guard from a physical therapist to being able to walk with a 4-point cane and just stand by assist. So he's not walking in the community. That walking with the cane is still takes a lot of effort for him. But the improvement in his balance and his ability to walk over ground, whether it's a 6-minute walk test or a 10-meter walk test, improved substantially over the course of that treatment. Now, it's important to know that he improved some from just the physical therapy. In most measures, he improved more when the stimulation was running. But it wasn't an open and shut case like we've seen in the hands, where there can often be no improvement at all during the therapy and only improvement when the stimulator is running. So that was interesting to us, that the therapy obviously had its own benefits. The stimulation amplified those benefits for some of the measures that we were looking at.
So you bring up a great issue about like community or not community.
Mm-hmm.
With the hands too, what are people actually able to do differently? Because I think, you know, we get excited about this stuff and I think it's fantastic and it bodes so well. But like, do people actually feel like they can do things themselves that they weren't able to do before? Can they cath themselves? Can they feed themselves? Can they, you know, drive? All those things that are really important to people with higher level injuries.
Yeah, let me touch on a couple of successes, because in Joe's case for the hands, it was very marked. So he was not able to bring his fingers and thumb together in what we call a tip-to-tip pinch, or that standard movement that you would use to pick up objects, before he joined the study. And it was during the time when we were applying the stimulation and the therapy that he was able to bring his fingers and thumb together. And he actually had about a 4 to 7-fold increase in the strength of being able to squeeze his fingers and thumb together. That allowed him to begin to feed himself again, which he hadn't done since his injury, and he continues to do that today. It allowed him to take pills on his own, which was a big deal, especially in the middle of the night. If he needed a baclofen dose, for example, he didn't have to wake up his caregiver to do that. And so those have been substantial quality of life differences. For our participant who was Asia B, he had no movement below the wrist, although he did have a fairly strong tenodesis grip, which he could activate. He is since learning to self-catheterize. I haven't heard that he's been successful, but he's learning that, which he certainly couldn't have attempted before. And he's also getting a modified automobile, and learning to drive. And some of that learning to drive, I'm sure, involves the tenodesis. We won't take all the credit for that. But I think both of those could be substantial independence differences for him.
So these folks that have gone through it, do they want to keep using it?
Most of them do. Most of them wonder what would happen if they had more stimulation, and certainly we would love to continue working with them, and hopefully we will again, but at the moment we're trying to keep the studies as short as possible, purely for the reason that that's the fastest way to get things out to the clinic.
Right.
The shortest possible study that demonstrates efficacy is the quickest way to get this approved. If we did a 1-year study or a 2-year study with each individual, it would just be that much longer until a device like this could be offered to the public.
Yeah. That has big impacts. So is Joe the only person you've done the lumbar stimulation with, or have you started other people now?
Yeah, Joe's the only person, but we're actually recruiting right now. So people who have incomplete injuries, whether it's cervical or mid-thoracic, that are interested, we're definitely screening. It's been a challenge to find people who have a reasonable bone density still many years after injury. We know that can reduce, and we are, of course, concerned about causing fractures doing these types of studies. So we're very cognizant. We need T-scores greater than -2 or -2.5. So making sure that the bones are ready for this sort of training, because when you turn the stimulator on, the spinal cord wakes up, and you're able to produce a lot more force with your leg muscles than you could without. Mm-hmm. And so that has caused actually some fractures, just one, with an epidural stimulator, which these things happen, right? There are fractures during transfers and other things, very unfortunate events. So we won't blame the epidural stimulator, but we're very cognizant of the idea that we want to make sure that the bones are healthy before we undergo this sort of accelerated gait training protocol.
Yeah, I would I mean, this may be my bias, but I would assume that people would be much more comfortable having something on the outside of their body versus inside. Do you think you can get the same benefits as some of the other work that's been done with actually implantable? Do you think you could do better?
Yeah, we don't know. At the moment, and studies have all been done at separate sites or separate paradigms, the results look comparable, but they haven't been compared head to head. And it's something we'd like to do. We're actually setting out to do an epidural stimulation study when we stumbled across this collaboration for the transcutaneous. And we've had such tremendous success with the transcutaneous that's where we're focusing right now. But let's talk a little bit about some of the exciting results with epidural stimulation, because there's 2 sites now just in the last few weeks that have demonstrated people who are both Asia A and Asia B able to be up walking either with a walker or parallel bars with the epidural stimulation running. And similar to our transcutaneous approach, it did take many sessions of therapy, at least 100, sometimes a couple hundred, almost 300 sessions in some cases. And some of those are with the stimulator running, and some of those are control sessions with just the therapy. But it does take a lot of hard work. Both of these solutions, the stimulator is just there as an amplifier, essentially. It still requires all the hard work of engaging in the rehabilitation and retraining those circuits and getting those muscles strong. But there's been several sites. Louisville University, Susan Harkema published a study just a few weeks ago, and the Mayo Clinic also published a study. And so between those two, I think there's 3 individuals at least that are up and walking. We may see another one very soon from a 3rd site. So it appears to be working at more than one site. That's always important. And it appears to be working even in people who are clinically motor and sensory complete. So in several people who are Asia A.
So that's really exciting. There's a lot of potential there. So one of the things that people have really thought have been beneficial is some of the effects on bowel and bladder function from the epidural stimulators. Are you seeing similar kinds of improvements when you're using the transcutaneous?
Yeah, we've seen modest benefits in bladder function in one of our participants, so that was very encouraging. He's also begun to sense temperature on his body, so there's some changes in sensation, which is exciting. But I do agree, I think the benefits for autonomic function, for blood pressure regulation, there's actually entire studies now with the epidural stimulator just focusing on orthostatic hypotension and blood pressure control, and they're quite successful in allowing people to both sit more upright or stand without either losing consciousness or at least losing cognitive ability. And so that alone was actually the foundation behind what they called the Big Idea, which is something the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation funded, which was to test epidural stimulation for nothing other than cardiovascular benefits. And the logic behind that was actually to try to get approval for a somewhat simple indication, and with the hope then that the stimulator could be used off-label for movement and bladder control and other things, but that might be the simplest sort of open or shut clinical trial. If you can show that you can reverse challenges with orthostatic or changing position, losing a loss of blood pressure, that might be a great entry. And those studies are still ongoing. They have, I think, 15 people implanted specifically in the blood pressure study.
Mm-hmm. So are you guys monitoring all of this stuff in your studies too? Like you're actually asking people about bowel and bladder function, measuring kind of heart rate and all those kind of things, orthostasis, all that kind of stuff?
Exactly. We're doing almost all of it. We're definitely doing surveys on bladder and bowel. We are measuring blood pressure during the therapy sessions. We're not doing tilt table tests and other things to challenge orthostatic hypotension, although there was just a study published by Andrei Karasakov at the University of British Columbia using a very similar transcutaneous stimulator and looking specifically at blood pressure regulation, and he did see benefits. I haven't reviewed that study in detail to be able to comment on it, but he did see benefits to blood pressure control with the transcutaneous.
Great. Are you having an easy time recruiting for your studies? Are you having a harder time? Where are you at with recruitment? And I know you guys are still looking for potential participants.
We are, yeah. It's interesting. We've actually had a much easier time recruiting for the upper extremity study. So we currently have a waiting list of about 5 people, and that puts us out at about a year, although we are still recruiting for that study. For our lower extremity study, we actually have openings right now. So we have had lots of interest, but we haven't been able to find the right match of bone density and geographic location. We get interest from all over the country, of course, being posted on clinicaltrials.gov. And so finding people who are able to live in Seattle for the 4 months at least. And we do follow-ups for an additional 3 months afterwards, but you could travel in for those. and a month of baseline testing about once a week. So it's a time commitment. It's an 8-month time commitment with that intensive 3-day-a-week period for about 4 months in the middle. But it's a nice way to get free physical therapy for either for your hands or for your legs. And to date, almost everyone we've worked with has seen some benefits. We did have one person leave the study early before he saw benefit. He chose to return to medical school, which we can totally respect. And he was an Asia B. He was halfway through and hadn't yet seen an improvement in function. So we would have loved to keep working with him, but we also completely respect his decision to get on with his life and continue on with medical school.
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting thought about like kind of when does this happen and what's going on in people's lives. And I think we see that a lot of, sometimes it's the focus is trying to get function back, and sometimes you accommodate and you figure out ways around it, and it's just easier to kind of keep going because it's interesting to think about obviously some of those like leg movement, unless you can actually get up and walk, some of it may be helpful to protect your skin, but maybe it's not always worth it. So interesting dilemmas to have, but super exciting on the research front because it's definitely moving us forward.
Yeah, very exciting.
What's kind of, you also mentioned there was some other stuff coming up, or other sites are doing some other things that are of real interest with this transcutaneous. Tell us more about what else is going on.
Yeah, so there's studies have just started at Craig Hospital in Denver, and that's really a study modeled after the one that we've done in the upper extremity. So stimulating the neck region, working on hand and arm function in combination with the physical therapy. Kessler in New Jersey is spinning up the same study. The Miami project, I think, has a stimulator, but is looking more at mechanisms. Rehab Institute of Chicago has been considering getting involved. And I'll have to think, there should be 5. I'll have to think of the 5th site. There's several sites in Europe as well. England, Scotland, and Ireland, I think, all have stimulators. So there's also an international testing of this same approach.
That's great. Are you guys all kind of coordinating and working together? So what a wonderful collaboration.
It is. Yeah, it's a fantastic team, and we do have regular calls, so people are working together and collaborating, both with the transcutaneous as well as even across the epidural space. So Matthew Roderick, who's with Unite to Fight Paralysis, actually organizes a call between all of us, both the epidural stimulation studies and the transcutaneous. And that's a really nice way to share best practices and keep up on what's going on in the field. So and that comes from the community. Matthew's a community organizer.
Yeah, which is cool because I think, some of the issues you're talking about in terms of study design and all those kind of things are really complicated. And so to get a bunch of people thinking about and being creative about how to go about it is really cool.
Yeah.
So on a little bit different note, I understand that you were part of the group that really helped the state of Washington to set aside some other funds for SCI research. Can you talk a little bit about that and kind of what your role has been and what that money is for?
Sure, absolutely. So it was really Bruce Hansen, who's a member of the community who has a spinal cord injury, and his wife, Kate Willett, who started this conversation many years ago. And it took a long time. They had some contacts on our state legislature. And after many years of discussing the best way to do this, they were able to write in what we call a state line, or a dedicated amount of money. It ends up being about $400,000 per year. The way we ended up doing it comes to the University of Washington, but then we have an open call and we distribute that to researchers that work on spinal cord injury as broadly as we can. And so that's had a tremendous impact on the research here in the state, because it's given a dedicated pool of funding. It's drawing people into spinal cord injury research, and it's really giving it that stable funding that it needs to push some of these studies forward. So we've had individuals who've looked at sleep, at hypnosis type therapy. We have people working on pressure and ultrasound treatments in the spinal cord. And then we have these studies of transcutaneous stimulation, including an implanted component. So the hope is to compare side by side in the same individuals the benefits of epidural and transcutaneous stimulation, which has yet to be done.
And so how many years is that committed to?
So we have money for the biennium, but we're actually meeting this fall with our representatives to try to make that permanent. It's a bit of a delicate issue because at the moment the funding sort of went below the radar a little bit, right? The reason that they chose 800,000 per biennium was that it wouldn't likely show up as a line item veto for people who are hunting through the budget to delete things. As you know, in Washington State, we're sometimes a bit libertarian with the way we view taxes and other things. And so compared to other states like New York, I was actually just in New York State yesterday for their spinal cord injury meeting, and they have about $6 million a year. And the way they raise that is through a surcharge on moving violations, on traffic tickets, because of the link between motor vehicle accidents and spinal cord injury. And they've had that now for about 20 years, I think. They went through a bit of a dry spell 10 years ago, they told me, but they were able to reinstate that. And there are other states. Kentucky has a really nice program, Florida, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. I haven't heard how the vote went, but I think they were voting even a few days ago on this issue. And almost all this started with the grassroots involvement of the community, of people who have spinal cord injuries, really working with their representatives, talking about how important this is, and eventually collaborating with the researchers to try to design maybe how the funding would be implemented. But it can have a tremendous impact on a state's ability to do spinal cord injury, and it can recruit researchers to that state. The advantage to the community there is that means the earliest clinical trials are often offered in that state, right? Whether it's a stem cell trial or an electrical stimulation trial. So University of Louisville, for example, has now I think 12 or more people implanted, and a long waiting list, of course, but the studies are happening in Louisville. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of an exciting magnet to draw in the clinical trials.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very cool opportunity. And, it's interesting because every time we talk about research, people say, the next best thing is going to happen any day now. So where do you see things? Like we're in October of 2018. Where do you see kind of these next big leaps happening? I mean, some of what you're seeing, do you think it's in the next 2 to 5 years that you're going to see these big changes where these are going to be more available to more people? Or do you think we're still 10 or 15 years out?
I think it's a lot less than 10 or 15 years, especially for the stimulation. I think the stem cells are probably still 10 or 15 out from full approval. There's obviously ongoing studies even today, and some have started and stopped, sadly, a little bit early. But I think the stimulation is really starting to show promise. And even just this fall with the publication of these 2 epidural stimulation papers, and then we've had our paper this summer on the hand function, and the UCLA group had a parallel paper with another group of subjects. I think that we're really starting to build momentum towards things that are making a functional difference. So at the moment, perhaps people aren't quite community ambulators, but what's coming down the pike looks really promising, and that some of this technology may very soon move out of the clinic. Still may be a research study, but it may be suitable for home use. Some of the epidural stimulators are already being used at home for standing, for blood pressure control, for these types of things. And so I think we're really on this cusp, on this tipping point, where the research has now started to demonstrate several different functional improvements. That was what we needed before, right? Before it was people were moving again when they couldn't, but that wasn't functional necessarily. So I think now that we've gotten to these functional benefits, I'm very hopeful that this will accelerate towards actual clinical implementation. And it's really just the last couple steps of getting the device manufacturers on board to actually, they have the devices already, but to modify them just enough to market them to spinal cord injury for movement as opposed to for chronic pain, for example, which is what the epidural stimulators are typically used for, and to get approvals for these non-invasive transcutaneous stimulators so that they can be distributed.
So one of the things that we've talked to a lot of people about is just when things are just for people with spinal cord injury, they tend to be very, very expensive and out of reach for most people. What do you think that is going to happen with this issue? I mean, I think that if this is something, do you think it's going to be more applicable to other disabilities? I mean, you mentioned stroke on the front end that kind of got you interested. That's a larger population, to be honest. Where do you think that we need to go to make it so that if somebody really wanted to use this in their therapy clinic and make it available not just to one patient at a time, but to all of their patients with spinal cord injury, or, if people wanted it for home use, that it could actually be cost, manageable.
Right, exactly. So I used to say when we were developing implantable devices like brain-computer interfaces and things that you absolutely had to leverage a larger population because there's a massive cost in developing a custom implantable neurosurgical device. With the transcutaneous, I think it's less required. The costs that have been thrown around are anywhere from $1,000 to $10,000 per unit, which still sounds expensive, but for a clinic to purchase that, that's well within reason. If there's some type of reimbursement that comes along, that's well within reason. And even the implantable stimulators, which are on the order of $30,000 to $40,000 before insurance, right, to have implanted. Again, sounds outrageously expensive, but the out-of-pocket expenses are quite reasonable. And there's several 100,000 people implanted with these pain stimulators, right, between deep brain stimulators and pain stimulators. So they're becoming somewhat common in medical practice. So I'm not sure that the design changes that need to be made to those implantables are going to be so expensive that we have to find other populations to benefit. Obviously, it would be nice to find other populations, and my colleagues are testing the transcutaneous stimulation for people with stroke. There's some talk about moving into Parkinson's disease with some of the stimulators. All of these would be great, especially if they help those patient populations. But I'm less sure now that we need to spread out the design cost, if you will, across multiple indications. And I actually think with the technology we have currently, we could push just in spinal cord injury, which would be nice to focus on that population and really design a device that's custom made for the challenges of spinal cord injury.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that would be fantastic. Anything else that you feel like we should be talking about, or anything I missed that you think is important?
Yeah, I think it's just a really exciting time in spinal cord injury research. I remember when I started as an assistant professor, people said, don't work on spinal cord injury research because you'll never get promoted. You'll never make tenure, right? Was the bar, because nothing works in the spinal cord, right? And that's kind of how it was for 20, 30 years. And I think in the last 10 years, it seems like many things are starting to work, whether they're stem cell trials or stimulators. And so I think that's a real paradigm shift that we all need to appreciate, that there are people standing and even walking with some assistance with these stimulators implanted. There are people moving their hands when they couldn't before, and there are people doing functional activities of daily living with their hands when they couldn't before. So even though the progress has been painfully slow, I'm sure, is how it looks from the other side, I feel like the last 5 or 10 years have actually been rapidly accelerating, and we finally have some options to pursue in terms of research for spinal cord injury.
Yeah, I think there's a big difference between looking for the cure and then looking for ways to improve people's function and quality of life.
Yeah.
And I think if we're still looking for the cure, I think we might still have a ways to wait.
Yeah, that's your 10 or 15 or maybe 20-year time horizon, right? The full stem cells rebuilding of the natural circuitry. I think that's a goal that's a little ways off.
Yeah.
But being able to do things in the meantime and doing these stimulation studies have really changed how we view spinal cord injury. We used to think of it really as a disconnection between the brain and the lower spinal cord, for anything Asia B, Asia A. But now I think we're really viewing it as there are those connections there. They're just not strong enough at first to help with movement or to cause control of blood pressure or bladder or bowel. So if we have strategies now to make those connections stronger, I think we can do this incremental improvement that you mentioned and hopefully eventually get to a cure. But in the meantime, at least improve quality of life substantially.
Excellent. We're doing this in October of 2018, and people will be listening to this for hopefully, months and maybe years to come.
Sure.
Where do people find out about your research and how to get more information, maybe how to get on the list to become a subject for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So our lab website, if you just Google my name, Chet Moritz, it's usually the first hit. It's called the Moritz Lab website or the Restorative Technologies Laboratory, and that has all the information about the clinical trials and the contacts for how to sign up for those trials. And you can also look at our Center for Neurotechnology website, and you can learn more about our studies there that expand beyond just the work we talked about today.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Chet, for joining us today.
Awesome. You're most welcome.
We look forward to hearing all the cool stuff you're doing in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the SCI Forum podcast. To learn more or to make a donation, please visit sci.washington.edu.